Chapter 2 Good for the Soul. Kris took a step forward. Noelle took a step back. An image sprang up suddenly in her mind, in the vague, half-remembered way of nightmares, forgotten until this moment. A crackling electric barrier at her back, and Kris in front of her, pushing her back towards that encroaching, inevitable pain. Forcing her on not with a raised hand, but with a simple command.
Proceed.
She took another half step of retreat, almost tripping over the steps behind her. Slowly, without taking her eyes off Kris, she climbed backwards up the steps until she felt her back press against the altar. Her heart raced as she realized there was nowhere to run to, no way to avoid confronting her friend, if that's even what they were to her. She didn't feel certain of anything anymore where Kris was concerned. A defiant voice in her head flared up, angry despite her fear, or perhaps because of it.
Why shouldn't I be able to confront them? Why should I want to run and hide from all my problems? I can be stronger than that, can't I?
Kris continued to approach until they were standing disarmingly close to her. Not saying anything, just looking her square in the eyes with a blank expression on their face. If they got any closer, she would have to clamber onto the altar to get away. Her voice shook, but she stood her ground and asked them.
Should I be afraid?
They quirked their head to one side, examining her curiously, like she was some kind of interesting specimen that they were trying to make sense of.
Are you afraid?
Noelle was torn between the honest answer and a desire to appear stronger than she felt, and so she bit her lower lip and said nothing.
I just want to talk,
Kris said, but something about their body language suggested a tension that belied their words. They held themselves rigid and upright, not like their usual slouched, inward-looking posture. Even in a room as large as the empty church, they seemed to take up more space than they should.
Why would you be scared of me?
Because...
Noelle started, swallowing roughly when she discovered that her throat was dry. She could feel goosebumps prickling under the fur of her arms, and she had to physically resist the urge to shiver.
I know it sounds silly, but because of what happened in that dream I had.
Don't lie.
Kris interjected suddenly, forcefully, making her wince.
Don't pretend like it was all something you imagined. You're better than that.
But if...
Noelle stammered.
If it wasn't a dream...
The possibility was so frightening that she hadn't wanted to look directly at it, but the words felt true on her tongue, and she knew Kris was right.
It wasn't a dream.
Lying to herself was a defense mechanism, and a useless one. She couldn't defend herself from the truth forever.
If it wasn't a dream...
She started over.
Then what do I call it?
Dark world.
She turned the phrase over in her head.
Dark world.
It sounded so strange, like something from a children's storybook, or one of those old fantasy video games that Kris and Asriel always used to talk about.
I can tell you have questions,
Kris said.
You're confused. I want to help. I want to show you that there's nothing to be afraid of.
They reached their hand out towards her, the hand with her watch on their wrist, and she involuntarily flinched away, tensing up with a sudden inhalation. Frustration flashed in Kris's eyes.
I can't help you if you're gonna keep freezing up like a deer in headlights every time I come near you.
They glanced to the side of the room and then turned and took a step away from her.
I have an idea. Come on.
She followed their gaze to the confessional along the far wall, essentially a wooden box split into two small booths, a door on each side. It took her a second to process what Kris was suggesting, and when it clicked, her first reaction was panic. Getting in that box in an enclosed space with them, talking to them like they were some kind of priest and she was confessing her sins? No way, it wasn't right. But then Kris looked back at her over their shoulder and said,
Come.
In that commanding voice that frightened her so much, and her brain began to quickly evaluate her options. Talk to Kris in there, where at least there would be a divider between them, or out here in the open, where there was nothing separating them but empty air and frayed tension. Her wounded ring finger throbbed. She came when called. Following Kris's lead, she entered one side of the confessional, while Kris went in the other. The booth was ornately carved from dark oak, standing out from the cool gray stone of the church walls like a dried bloodstain on soiled snow. Inside, it was gloomy with shadows, and the air felt hotter somehow, though not enough to break the spell of cold shivers that still held Noelle in its icy fingers. She could hear the pulse of her nervous heartbeat in her ears, but nevertheless, she sat down and faced Kris. The lattice divider between the booths made their face look fragmented. Her eyes traced the pattern to avoid looking back at the eyes watching her.
Crisscrossed lines.
She thought vaguely.
Back and forth and back again.
That's better.
Kris said.
Now we can talk.
What did you want to talk about?
In the dim shadows through the screen, she thought she saw the ghost of a smirk on their face.
You tell me. This is your confession.
Indignation filled her throat.
I don't have anything to confess.
If that were true, you would have just run home instead of coming here.
Her mouth worked furiously, but no sound came out. Had Kris always been so perceptive? It felt like they were seeing right into her mind, cutting through her defenses and straight to the truth.
Fine.
She relented.
You want to talk? Let's talk about you. You scare me, Kris. You're different. The Kris I grew up with would have never made me do all those things. Made me hurt people.
Not people.
Kris interjected.
Enemies. They would have hurt you if you hadn't hurt them first. That's how it works in the dark world. I only wanted you to be able to protect yourself. And I never made you do anything. I instructed you, sure, but you make it sound like I literally moved your hands for you. Take a little responsibility, Noelle.
Something like, but not quite, a smile crept into their voice.
You're not a puppet.
She blinked, thrown off track. Was that true? Had Kris only suggested rather than commanded? Was she just deflecting guilt for her own choices onto them?
If only I could remember more clearly.
She shook her head, redirected.
Birdley wasn't an enemy, Kris. He was a classmate. A friend.
That's an exaggeration.
Kris scoffed.
He was a nuisance at best. You're not gonna miss him, trust me. Always fawning over you like an overeager puppy. Like a dumb little nerd with a childish crush. I always wondered, was that why you kept him around? For the attention? I know he wasn't your type, but maybe you just liked feeling wanted.
She was glad that it was too dark in the booth for them to see her eyes growing wet. Angry tears welled up unbidden.
Shut up.
You know, he wasn't into you either, right? Not really. It was all a pretense, even if he didn't realize it at first. It's ironic, actually. Do you want to know who he really had eyes for?
Her fists clenched into balls, fingernails biting into her palms. Violent tension held futilely in her lap, directed inward.
I said, shut up.
Kris leaned closer to the lattice screen, their voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper.
It was Susie he wanted. Isn't that funny? He wasn't your friend, he was your rival. You were just a stepping stone on his way to snatching the object of your desire out from under your nose. You meant nothing to him. He would have taken everything from you.
You don't know what you're talking about.
She snapped.
How would you know any of this? You weren't friends. Birdley wouldn't have admitted all of that to you.
Kris sought back, looking thoughtful.
Well, maybe not. Not in this life, anyways.
She had no idea what that meant, but the comment unnerved her all the same. The anger building inside her was suddenly frosted over with fear again.
Kris?
She said slowly.
What did you do with him? Birdley was there, in the library, and then he was gone. You know where he is, don't you?
Their eyes flicked back to look at her, little pinpricks of light in the shadows.
You don't have to worry about it. It's taken care of.
What does that mean?
Just keep your mouth shut and we won't have a problem. What happened to him was an unfortunate accident, but no one's gonna suspect you had anything to do with it. Not perfect, innocent, angelic Noelle, who's never got into any trouble in her life.
Their voice sounded almost mocking. She didn't recognize this person in the booth opposite her, the person she'd known all her life. She'd never heard them talk like this before. She wanted to flee, to distance herself from them. But more than that, she wanted to know why. She wanted some reason, an explanation she could grasp, something to fill the void of horror that had taken the place of her childhood companion. Mouth dry, voice quivering, she asked,
What happened to you?
What do you mean?
You know what I mean. You're not yourself, Kris.
Their voice sounded a little bit amused, a little disappointed.
You still think of me as a kid, don't you? So I've changed. So what? You've changed too. Are changing. That's what happens when people grow up. It's natural.
Not like this.
She protested, but now her mind was spinning. Kris was the only human she knew, but she'd heard of human children of their age went through a lot of changes and growth very quickly. Was this kind of personality change just a human thing? Was it normal?
Could that really be all it is?
It felt like too simple an explanation, but she didn't have a better one.
I'm still Kris.
They persisted.
I've just leveled up a bit. I'm more than I used to be. I know it can feel hard to accept, but it's okay for people to change.
Tears welled up in her eyes again, embarrassing her. She tried to blink them away, afraid that Kris would see, but it was too late to make them stop. She'd always been a crier, ever since she was a little kid, and she'd had plenty of practice since then. After Des had, well, she thought she would cry so hard that her eyes would go blind. Kris had been a shoulder to cry on back then. Day after day, even when she had been an inconsolable wreck, they had never seemed to mind comforting her.
I don't like it when things change.
She admitted weakly, her voice breaking on the last word.
Not all change is bad.
Kris said calmly, rationally, in a softer voice than before.
Not all pain either. It's like exercising a muscle. You have to stress it to make it stronger. But then, the stronger you get, the harder it is to hurt you.
They raised their hands to the divider, pushing just their fingertips through the gaps in the lattice.
Don't you see, Noelle? The world is bigger than you thought, and scarier and more dangerous, and you're not strong enough to handle it on your own. Not yet. It's time you grew up too. But I don't want to hurt you. I want to make it impossible for you to get hurt.
She wanted to believe them, even now, even after everything. She wanted to trust Kris so badly that she could feel it like an ache inside her. Maybe it was silly for her to be afraid of them. Maybe their intentions were good, even if bad things had come of those intentions. The more she thought about it, the more ludicrous it seemed that she had been treating Kris as if they were a threat. Running from them, flinching from their touch like a frightened child. It made no sense. She and Kris had known each other their whole lives. They were like a sibling to her, or at least the closest thing to a sibling she still had. If she couldn't trust them, then who could she trust? The angel was supposed to be forgiving, and they were in its house, and everyone, since she was a kid, had always called Noelle an angel. She reached her hand to Kris's, their fingertips brushing through the lattice frame.
Promise?
She asked.
Promise I won't ever have to go back to that dark world or do those horrible things ever again?
Promise.
Kris said.
I sealed that fountain with your help, so that place is gone now. It can't hurt you anymore.
They smiled and added a bragging note to their voice.
Actually, you and me. We kind of saved the world, you know.
Noelle laughed, just a quick little exhalation, more from disbelief than humor, but it felt like tons of weight being lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in days, she felt herself start to relax.
So, what? We just go back to normal?
Sure.
Kris said, and then added gently.
I'm sorry I scared you. I didn't mean to. I need you, Noelle. I don't know what I'd do without you.
The flood of relief she felt hearing that almost made her start crying again. Thank the angels she still had her friend.
I'm sorry I doubted you. Tried to push you away when I should have just talked to you first. I must have made you feel terrible.
It's okay.
Kris said, in that confident, calm voice that sounded so different from the withdrawn, quiet kid she'd once known. Maybe not such a bad voice, really, once you got used to it.
It's okay, Noelle. I forgive you.
There was still a dull and stabbing pain in her finger, and a chill under her skin. But just then, in that moment, Noelle barely even noticed anymore. That concludes Chapter 2.
Up next, Chapter 3, Broken Clockwork.
Look at that cool fan art. Wonder who did that one.
Yeah, I wondered.